I'm here with Charlie Dent, who served more than 13 years in the House as a Republican under 3 different presidencies. And we're going to talk about one of the biggest challenges facing Congress today, if not the biggest challenge facing Congress, and that is a lack of trust in the institution. So I'm excited to have you. I'm excited to speak with you about this.
Well, I'm delighted to be here and look forward to the conversation.
So I cover Congress for Time Magazine, and one of the things I've noticed is that this is a historically unproductive term. There seems to be more infighting, more chaos, less bills are being passed than normal. What do you make of this current Congress, and why do you think they're so unproductive?
Well, when you have a divided government, so that obviously plays to it. Two, you have a House Republican majority that really does not have a functional majority. That's also plays into it. It's a very narrow margin, and we've seen some things that have been, frankly, unprecedented. I think in my lifetime, where it took 15 rounds to elect a speaker, having a speaker removed from office, then going through several rounds before getting another speaker. We've had in the House anyway issues where Republicans could not simply bring their bills to the floor. I think there are 6 or 7 rules that were defeated. I mean, this never happens in Congress. The majority party passes the rule to set the terms and conditions of the bill that will be considered. But if the majority can't bring up its own bills, well, then it's easy to understand why it's hard to get bills passed if you can't even elect a speaker, if you can't even bring the bills you want to bring to the floor. So I think that's part of the reason why it's been so dysfunctional. Plus, you've got a divided government where it's always more difficult to enact legislation. A presidential year coming up, I mean, they had a real opportunity to pass a border security legislation, serious border security legislation, and then scuttled it for political reasons.
Mm-hmm. And the lack of trust in Congress might be related to that. Polls have consistently shown that Americans trust the legislative branch less than any other area of government, only 34% according to Gallup. Compare that to local government, which enjoys the trust of 67% of Americans. What do you think that means for Congress and our democracy more broadly, and why does it matter?
Well, I think it happens for a few reasons. One, I think Congress, for far too long, has really surrendered much of its authority to the executive branch and increasingly to the judicial branch, where the judicial branch is making decisions. You just had a decision on bump stocks. I think the bump stocks should be banned, but Congress should have banned it. And the court said, well, the administration didn't have the authority to do that. But Congress, by failing to act, has allowed the executive branch to engage more on these issues, on whether it's immigration and the border or the bump stock or trade or pick your favorite issue. Congress has become less relevant in these major policy discussions. And I think that's a part of the reason why they're not seen a very high esteem by the public. For that reason, you mentioned local government. Sure, local government, you're running a municipality, you have to get the trash picked up, you need police protection, water and sewer, sanitation services. They're very practical, and they're about results usually, about getting things done, basic service. And when Congress can't do the basics, it's not a surprise that their favorability ratings continue to decline.
And among young people, the situation is even worse. A recent Harvard Institute of Politics poll has trust in Congress down to just 12% among 18 to 29-year-olds during an election year, a critical election year. How do you restore young people's trust in government?
That's a tough question. I think one of the challenges we face in this country with not just young people, but all people, is that, it's the way people get their information anymore. A lot of people, it's not that there's not a lot of trust in the information that they're getting. I mean, we don't agree on basic facts anymore. People get information from sources that reinforce their existing opinions and biases, and they don't go to a different site or change the channel. And I think that's an issue. It's an issue. It's an issue in Congress as well. I mean, members not agreeing on the basic facts. What's the truth? And so I am not at all surprised that the trust level is so low, particularly among younger people. And I don't know that I have a simple answer for that, but I'm going to blame part of this on social media, the way people get their information. But at the end of the day, Congress is going to have to prove that it is productive, that it can advance issues that respond to the needs and concerns of the American people, which they have not done enough of in recent years.
Mm-hmm. And you were a moderate Republican during your time in Congress. But today's Republican Party looks a little different. They tend to focus more on culture war issues, targeting DEI programs, critical race theory. These are issues that don't really resonate much with young people. The data shows that young people care about climate change and gun control. Um, so why do you think the Republican Party continues to wage this fight when the young people care about issues that differ from this?
Well, I think right now the Republican Party, in my estimation, has become very much of a populist party. I might call it an illiberal populist party, as defined by the MAGA movement, which, it doesn't have it's not really focused on core guiding principles. And in my day job is I work at the Aspen Institute, run the Congressional Program, but I also am involved with a group as a senior advisor to Our Republican Legacy, set up by former Senators Jack Danforth, Alan Simpson, and Bill Cohen, and to really talk about creating an alternative narrative to MAGA and talk about guiding principles that have sustained the party for 170 years. We talk about things like the Constitution and respecting outcomes, the rule of law, peaceful transfers of power. January 6th was a horrible day. We also talk about unity in the Union. Abraham Lincoln, our founder, bringing this country together, as divided as diverse as it is, bringing it together, and that your political opposition is not your enemy. They're not Vladimir Putin. They're an adversary. They might be misguided, but they're not your enemy. They're your fellow Americans and people with whom you should work. So we talk about principles like that. We talk about getting back to some sense of fiscal responsibility, about open markets and these tariffs that MAGA is proposing right now, that the MAGA movement is proposing. We think this is a terrible policy, but we need to have an alternative argument that I think not only a lot of Republicans want to hear, who are disillusioned or who are dispirited or feel suppressed, but a lot of younger people want to hear this too, as do frankly a lot of independents and Democrats who would agree with these principles. So getting back to this, and also the final principle I would mention was, a constructive foreign policy based on peace through strength, embracing allies, pushing back against tyrants, and seeing allies as an asset and a force multiplier, not as liabilities. So we want to get back to these kinds of discussions that would unite Republicans from Abraham Lincoln through Theodore Roosevelt, through Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and the Bushes. These roots are deep. I'm not saying we go back to where we were, but some of those principles are enduring. The MAGA principles, if they are principles, they've been only around, 7 or 8 years. And those roots aren't real deep. These principles I'm talking about should guide us into the future, not about, we talk about rule. We want to talk about rule of law, not about, the law of rulers, but rule of law. And so we want to get back to this kind of conversation that would, I think, appeal to a lot of voters, and especially young people who want something better than just culture war grievance politics. When I was in elected office, I never talked about these issues. Never. You would respond to questions, but we would never raise them because we just did not. I didn't think in a district like mine that was appealing to a broad swath of the electorate.
And a common concern in recent years is that the older generations are overrepresented in politics, specifically in Congress. Do you think that's an issue? And how can we create more pathways for younger people to get involved in politics?
Well, I guess define young. Again, I got elected to Congress at the age of 44. I was elected to the State House of Representatives at the age of 30. So I do see a lot of young people getting elected to office, particularly at the state level, some at the congressional level. We've seen members of both parties get elected at young ages. Patrick McHenry, who's now a veteran, he was 26 when he was elected. He came in with me. So I've seen plenty of younger folks elected. I could argue that at 44, I still felt pretty young. But actually, I think we do. But you're right. There are, particularly in the Senate. We often do joke about the age of the Senate. There's a lot of truth to it. It tends to be a much older body. But the House, I think the House has done a better job of bringing in younger representatives from both sides over the years. But could we do better? Probably, but I think the track record has been better than most people would realize.
Understandably, politicians are concerned a lot with their personal politics rather than the way the institution is viewed as a whole. Do you think that politicians have a responsibility to, consider how young people trust the government and how more people generally trust the government?
Absolutely. And one of my main criticisms of Congress, of the House, particularly over the last couple of years, is that there was no real enforcement of standards. We saw, take for example, George Santos. He was a national laughingstock and he and other members who get into some very serious trouble try to monetize this notoriety. And there used to be a time when members who get in that sort of trouble would have the good sense to resign from Congress, to avoid further shame to be brought upon themselves or their families or their constituencies. And they put those interests above their own, knowing that they transgressed in some ways, often for non-criminal matters. And I feel like we've kind of lost this ability to self-police. Now, in the case of Santos, the chair of the Ethics Committee, Mike Guest, and Susan Weil, the ranking member, did a good job. They did a thorough investigation. They ultimately expelled him. And people say, well, why did it take so long? I said, because normally members who got into trouble that Santos got into would have had the sense to resign long before. That's why there have been so few expulsions in the history of the House. Most of them resigned long before it reached that point. But now you have people, who just don't, too many of them, who just don't feel shame, who flaunt the rules. And I think this is really, it's incumbent upon the leaders of both parties, the Speaker and the minority leader in particular, to enforce standards of conduct. Because that drags it down. When they read about a George Santos carrying on like he does, or MTG, or pick your favorite person, Jamal Bowman pulls a fire alarm. I mean, at some point they need to enforce standards.
And you chaired the House Ethics Committee, right?
Yeah, we had to sanction members, often for non-criminal conduct. And believe me, this was hard on these members, and it inflicts a certain amount of reputational damage. And I guess that's one thing that a lot of some of these members just don't kind of flaunt that. I guess it doesn't. They can monetize this notoriety.
Right.
They can wear that. They can wear these complaints. They can wear their indictments, as a badge of honor, and then raise money off it. I mean, in the world I grew up in, an indictment was a political death sentence for the most part, and also some of these other types of scandals would have been career enders.
Yeah.
And now, it's just another day that ends in Y in many cases.
So do you think if there was more accountability for your actions, more transparency, that people would have more trust in Congress?
I think so. I think they would. I mean, if you're a young person looking at government and you see a guy like George Santos carrying on and, a fabulous, making up stories about himself and his constituents, and, you see the Taylor Greens or the Bowmans of the world, and you start to wonder, is this a serious place? And fortunately, those voices tend to be elevated. Most of the members are very good, honorable people. They're going out doing their jobs, keeping their heads down, doing their committee work, and trying to get into the weeds of policy and legislation. But that's not particularly interesting, frankly, to the media. That's not always interesting. I mean, they like the controversy, they like the stories, and hey, say what you will about some of those members I just mentioned who are on the naughty list, but there's news value there, and frankly, sometimes there's entertainment value in it all. But it's damaging the institution, and it's making it harder for the serious members to kind of get their positions and their views elevated. And one of the reasons I became more outspoken over the years is I used to get tired of hearing some of our loudest voices at the time, who by comparison today were quite mild, who were getting all this attention for saying what I thought were pretty reckless or in many cases incendiary statements. And I said, but we have to go up. Those of us who are a little bit more pragmatic, maybe a little bit more moderate, we have to elevate our voices and push back and speak, because quite often the extremes, their outrageous rhetoric is met with silence in too many cases. And that's not a good way to counter a narrative. And if you're a young person who is skeptical about Congress, and you see, and the only names are Taylor Greene and AOC and a few others, I can see why maybe you get a little jaded.
And I want to end on this. Are you optimistic that trust in Congress will return back to where it was?
I don't know that Congress was ever thoroughly loved. I mean, but I think Congress can be better than it is. Like I said, I think there are a lot of really good people in both parties who serve in the U.S. Congress, House and Senate, and Republican and Democrat. There are a lot of really good people who want to do their jobs. But until members push back against the hardest elements of their bases, I mean, I say push back, I mean lead it, instead of trying to too often I have felt that the elected leaders in Congress were afraid of the members, afraid of their own members, and a lot of the members were afraid of their constituents. And, you know, I tell you what, the fear factor in Congress is overwhelming. I think a lot of these members need to break out of that fear and realize they have this wonderful opportunity to do good things, And they start, at some point, you have to start thinking less as a member. You have to start thinking less about the political consequences of all your decisions. You're going to get criticized no matter what you do. But if you stand out there and you do what you think is the right thing for your district and for your country, you'll have an easier time defending it, and you'll be happy to talk about it. And you'll be shocked that a lot of your constituents, even if they may disagree with you, they'll respect you. And that's what I found, that every time I thought I did something that was a political career ender, I realized that, you know, sometimes you have to risk your job in order to save it. But sometimes those things ended up elevating me politically, and I not anticipating it. And I think that's where members have to realize it's okay to take risks, take political risks. You might be surprised how your voters will react.
Well, thank you so much for this insightful conversation.
Thank you.
It's great having you.
Thank you. It was fun.